we're basically in a larger, more inclusive perspective and a larger, more inclusive experience.
And that place from which perspective generates, I'm interpreting what you just said, you correct me if I'm wrong, that perspective can move at any point, right? Mm-hmm. It can be from different archetypes, it can be from the stillness, it can be from, and in relationships too, I've found that when I'm looking at a relationship from one vantage point, it limits what's possible for us.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think one of the hallmarks of a spiritual maturity, or even a human maturity, is the ability to shift perspective.
Yes.
Because even as a spiritual teacher, we often use these words that give this impression, which I think is a false impression ultimately.
Dangerous.
That there's some ultimate perspective that is the right and correct perspective, as if unity consciousness or something is the correct perspective. But if I'm a 3-year-old kid and someone's threatening my life and my mother's next to me, I want her to be in a fierce perspective, right? I don't want her to just be kind of going, it's all one, so it really doesn't matter.
If you're punching Billy.
Right, it doesn't, it does matter. Mm-hmm. And so, I think the ability to shift perspective is really vital to our functionality.
Yes, and the wholeness journey, if we can call it that. The whole idea, whether it's Gestalt awareness practice or whatever versions of practices that facilitate and encourage that different seat.
Yes.
I even physically do it sometimes. Like I'll be on a tour bus and I'll just think I'm not, I'll be in the middle of some professional drama of some kind, fill in the blank, and then I'll just lie on the ground sometimes just to look from a different place, and I'll come up with different answers versus from sitting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm wondering, Alanis, could we switch seats?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll just lie down and try that on. No, the other day I was having a call with my legal team. And I was in Big Sur, and I just thought, wow, this is a real shift from, connection with the earth in such an intense way as Big Sur is for me. And I was having a call around a legal conversation. I thought, I'm going to take this entire legal call lying down. I only got up twice because I got really feisty, but I just thought this. Couldn't help myself, but the whole idea of being able to see something from a different perspective, basically. And that whole idea, whether it's Tong Len or whatever it is, the capacity to be able to sit somewhere else inside. I've done a lot of work around, I remember interpreting a lot of Gestalt interpretation of dreams and Jungian interpretation of dreams, getting inside of my mother's body and having a sense of how she perceives me. It was just a guess, it's not a concrete confirmed perspective that she has. I couldn't be so arrogant as to think that I know her perspective, but it was a guess that shifted things.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of human adulthood, I think. And by adulthood, I don't mean that we achieve it simply because we're at a certain age, but a kind of maturity. Yeah.
Okay. And what do you mean? Is the capacity to have a different perspective, or what do you mean by that?
It is the capacity to have a different perspective,
right.
To be able to change, to even be able to be interested in another perspective.
Right.
I think that's where it starts. Like you said, right. You're not even going to see what life might look like through your mother's eyes until you're really interested
right.
in what it might actually, how she might be experiencing life.
Yes.
I think that's a huge developmental step for a human being.
And the quality that would be required of us humans to sit in another seat would be, my guess would be curiosity and empathy. And for me, the big topic lately has been the idea of how do we move from this narcissistic fear of development of self. So there's this idea that if we're going to have this quality of curiosity that is sort of a prerequisite for inquiry and empathy, that it would require us to, in some way, dive into the ego and the psychology of the development of a sense of self in order to be able to access some of the other, maybe more esoteric.
The wider perspective.
Yes.
Yeah. And
So the bridging of the humanity and the egoic development, and that's why I love your writings, because there was no part of you that would poo-poo the psychological development of the self.
no, because it's so vital to our functionality. And I even, what I've seen also in my teaching work is that, sure, anybody, the beautiful thing is that anybody has a potential for a massive shift in perspective, even if they're a complete mess. You know,
Especially if they're a complete mess.
Sometimes, that's a very good point. Sometimes, especially.
Damn the torpedoes.
We feel like a mess. But I think the other thing is in order to kind of continue to access it, and especially in order to start to embody it, to be able to kind of live it and relate from it and talk to lawyers from, you know,
and
from
giggle.
that.
Yeah.
That needs this human body, mind, and psychology to not be in so much conflict, because the conflict just keeps.
It drains your energy.
It drains energy. There's no space inside for it. So
Yeah.
whether we do it before any shift or after a shift, nobody really gets away from their own humanity.
Right.
Not for very long.
Yeah, we can try.
We do try.
Yeah.
Yeah, we absolutely do try. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but because otherwise there's no, these are the vehicles that the Spirit's going to express itself through. And I think it's one of the exciting things about today is people are not for the most part, they're even in their sort of spiritual domain, they're not satisfied necessarily with just an internal revelatory spiritual experience anymore. Most people that I meet they're hooked up in such a way that it only is really deeply meaningful to them unless it actually starts to transform how they move and experience
The practical.
their contribution
Yes.
to life.
Specifically the contribution, like the service part?
Yeah. Especially nowadays.
So is it safe to say, based on what you just said, that if people are feeling that unrest from lack of service, that they would then inquire?
Sure.
Potentially?
Sure. I think any kind of feeling of unrest is the beginning place.
Is a catalyst.
Is a catalyst to look more deeply and to see what am I called for, and when, because there's a time when it seems to me that it's perfectly relevant that we're called in this really internalized way. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that's how it shows up. And then sometimes we're called in a way that's not actually so internalized. We're called to participate in some really meaningful, what's meaningful to us. You know, nobody else they may or may not get it, but if it's meaningful to us,
right.
That's its own kind of calling.
Yeah, the pull.
The pull.
Yeah.
Which is, I think that's what to love is really all about. But you have to want to participate. You have to want to engage. You have to want to, you know, that mysterious thing happens, that wherever love shows up in whatever form amongst friends or lovers or even strangers, you know, when there's that moment of intimate connection, there's something that happens that's bigger than what either two people bring.
Yes, 1 + 1 = 7.
Yes.
And for me, my care for my own personal experience and for my fellow friends is what to do, say, be around the idea or the experience of someone not being curious or not feeling connected or not even having a yearning or a curiosity or an empathy, to how to support that. You know, for a long time, I didn't understand the idea of not being able to appeal to a human heart. And then Marianne Williamson, if I can dare drop her name, we were doing a Q&A on stage, and there was a question about evil. And my quick sort of spiritual response was, and I actually stand by it in some senses, was that, human beings are, maybe we're traumatized, maybe we're disconnected, and our behavior ideally would be separate from the truth of who we essentially are. And that our behavior can be abominable, it can be disconnected, it can be separatist-based, it can be, but that the core of the human being, and this really pertains to parenting as an idea too, the idea of separating behavior from the human being. Like that behavior doesn't work in this context if you want to connect. But it might work, you know, on a football field if you slap your fellow football player's butt, high fives. If you did it on a bank lineup, you'd be arrested. So the idea that it's all context, but also the idea of separating the human being from the behavior, especially with 3-year-olds. You know, having oatmeal thrown in my face doesn't mean my son is evil. It just means that he wanted to throw oatmeal in my face.
He couldn't figure out a better way to express what he was feeling. Seemed relevant at the time.
And so how to bring that, you know, for people who are naturally kind of inquisitive and empathic and compassionate, or all these lovely terms, it seems in some ways that they have maybe an advantage. And then those of us who are super disconnected from God or self or other, and that existential loneliness of experiencing the falsehood of the separatism. Yeah. What to do then?
Yeah. It's a great question. It's a big question, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. I often think that, maybe I'll tell it with a quick story. I like stories better than blah, 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 blah. This is going back years ago in my mid-20s, and I worked at this bike shop in a little repair department, and there was a bunch of guys, and we all worked, and it was a very guyish environment, you know. And there was one guy that worked there that was really, I mean, he couldn't get 2 words out without one of them being a direct insult, and an intentional insult, whether it's to you or your mother or to whoever's closest in your life. You know, he was like a Beethoven of insulting. And you know, no matter what you did, you couldn't get through. You just couldn't break through.
There's no appealing.
You couldn't appeal, but you could feel, I could certainly feel this underlying sort of real sorrow and sadness and all this in him. And after, you know, we worked for months and months, and one day I just met him in the hallway, and he didn't say anything, and I don't even know what got over me, but I just stopped and I just looked at him, and I said, you know what, I don't buy it. And he was kind of like, you know, his little hairs stood up, and you know, he goes, what do you mean, what you buy? And I just said, you know, all that crap you do when you talk about, you insult everybody, I just said, I don't buy it, that's not you. And I didn't even know what I was intending or anything. And I was so surprised. Of course, it doesn't always happen this way. But I just had a moment of, you know, who knows how it happened, of honesty. You know? I was expressing myself rather than trying to tell him something about him. And he just looked at me. And he said, you know what? You're right.
Bless.
And we walked up the stairs onto literally the roof of this place where there were tables and stuff on the roof. And he just sat there for the next 45 minutes and told me about his life. And it was a catastrophe. Yeah. But sometimes, you know, when we meet people, it seems to me whether it's hard to gain an access to a real conversation, to a reality, that it almost like it takes one of us to just be real. Even if it's to say, you know, I don't really know what to say to you.
Or to say no.
Or to say no.
Yeah, no,
right.
I'm not buying it.
Sometimes there's to say no, or sometimes to set a boundary.
Usually a boundary. And then sometimes for me to just let go that there's any hope of appealing. Yeah. And then what that requires of me.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Alanis, I'm curious about something, because here Adya's books have obviously been really important to you. And he's offered us this definition of awakening, of moving out of an egoic framework, looking at things from different perspectives. And I'm curious to know, in your own life story, how and when moving out of an egoic framework became such a passion for you, something that obviously is so important to you.
Thanks for that. That's so nice to feel seen once every 3 years. I feel seen by you. Well, it started very young. I think my role in my family was of the family therapist, so it was sort of required of me to ask 17 questions. I called it trying to get to the lowest common denominator. Like, you mentioned this beautifully in one of your books, the idea of questioning until you're done, there's no more question. So I used to do that on a psychological level, and some of it was dysfunctional because it was age inappropriate. And then I remember when Jagged Little Pill came out, I had this egocentric thought that I was the only person going through these particular experiences, and then when millions of people around the world said, not only do I relate to it, but I want to take it to a whole other level in conversation, I thought, wow, so fame in and of itself wasn't as enticing to me as I thought it would be. I was sold the same bill of goods I think all of us are sold, which is that as a famous person, that Johnny Depp would be spooning me. And that Meryl Streep would be petting my head. So I just thought it would be a big kumbaya celebrity experience. And it wasn't. And so I actually wound up realizing that fame had it be such that I was projected upon, that I was this screen, and people's moms and ex-bosses and ex-girlfriends and aunties that molested them, and all kinds of projections of what a horrible woman I was. Meanwhile, I was just a brown-haired girl from Canada. So I was holding a lot of incoming projections. And I remember the turning point after Jagged Little Pill, the tour ended. I thought, if I'm going to continue on this journey of fame, which was very devastating to me because I wanted to connect. And I used to love people watching. And then all of a sudden, when fame happened, I became the watched. And that wasn't what I agreed to. So I didn't like that part. But I thought, if I'm going to continue this, and there seems to be a momentum to continue it, I thought I want to be of service. And so these songs seem to be supporting people and reminding them and assuaging them and affirming them and validating them and empathizing with them and championing them. And I just thought, well, let's just keep doing that. And then it got fun for me. Like, this is the most fun thing in my whole life.
Thank you.
So I want to take this frame of awakening in the world and go directly into the topic of relationships, because I think for most of us, we can have an experience of feeling outside of our egoic being, perhaps when we're on a meditation retreat or at a yoga program. Then we come home and our partner says something. Well, in my case, it might be like, can we talk about your schedule? Relatively innocent comment, and it's not just all the hair on my back, whatever. I'm incapable of having a conversation, even though before that I was doing all this loving kindness practice. And so I'd like to hear from both of you what it means to bring this quality of spiritual awakening into your relationships.
Wow, big. That's all, huh?
That's all. Serious small talk out there. Would you like to go first?
I'm not sure, but I'll give it a shot.
Okay, you go. I'll be right behind you.
To me, it goes back to one of my original impulses for the whole spiritual search to begin with. One was for enlightenment, when I didn't know what the heck that meant, but talked about that a little bit this morning. And the other one was looking around in life, as we often do when we're in our late teens, early 20s, and I just went, there's a lot of insanity out here. And I mean garden variety insanity, where people just they're not treating each other very well. And I just sort of thought, okay, right, then I want my life to be a different contribution than that. I want to contribute something other than insanity. This combined with it became part of my spiritual search. One was an inner, like what I wanted to realize. The other one was what I wanted to be able to contribute. And then when it comes into, relationship, of course, as you just suggested in your own direct way, Tami, it's where the rubber hits the road. And I think a lot of people in the domain that I teach in, spiritual seekers, I think a lot of them, what they come to realize is just because they've had some profound revelation does not guarantee that they're actually going to be know how to relate in a mature way, or relate from what they've seen. And so that becomes a whole other journey that's much more about, in my experience, it's not so much about these immense, grand realizations as it is to actually begin to embody them and start to relate from them is actually something, in the way I experience, is something sort of small and very, very close. Because it's all about a willingness to be intimate and close and actually really be loving and wondering what that actually means in all these situations, when you agree, when you disagree, when you're happy, when you're upset, you know. And to me, so much of it boils down to a willingness to actually stay really, really intimate and really, really listen. Give you an example. This is a very small example because this wasn't a problematic moment at all, but I was in the office last week, and I was talking to somebody in the office, and they were telling me about something, you know, I can't even remember exactly what it is, but some way I was contributing to something that was happening in the office, and they were saying really, really nicely, like, you could maybe do it in a way that makes my life easier. Basically, it's what was being told to me. They didn't say it that way, but I kind of got the feel, and I started to have a sense that there was an openness for a conversation here, and so I just decided to open the door. I just stepped through and I said, okay, so tell you what, why don't you tell me how I can make what you do easier and more enjoyable? How could I do that?
Is this your employee or you? That's awesome.
Yeah.
Good boss.
Instead of just saying, okay, let me address this one thing, which we did, but I wanted to open the door. But I think that takes like a listening, it takes a willingness to hear what someone's trying to communicate, you know, and really wanting, because I actually really want to be as, you know, a life-affirming or positive contribution to anybody's life, even just in this small way, as I want them to be the same thing in my life. You know, I want it to be this give and take. And it's a sort of a small moment, but I think these little doorways open in our relationships all the time. And whether we're willing to walk through those doors or not walk through those doors, whether we're willing to really look at ourselves again or fresh. You know?
With every interaction?
With every interaction. Yeah, with every interaction. Because I've never seen an end to this thing. You know, to the growth of love and intimacy. And, you know, to me, intimacy is just kind of a closeness. It's an energy. Yes. It's a feel that we're willing to be together. Yeah. You know, where neither one of us are sort of in a hierarchical position. Yeah. You know, and as soon as we run into any problems, the tendency is to start to move into hierarchical position.
Better than, worse than.
Better than, I want to be heard first, then I'll listen. You know, that's you're starting. And these little things happen which are very human.
That feels very animal, right?
Yeah.
Like if I'm not heard, I'm going to die, or I don't trust that I won't hurt you, or whatever, the animal part.
It's like if we're feeling hungry, it's like, I can't have a conversation with you, I need to eat first.
My blood sugar needs to...
Right, I got to get my blood sugar up so I can hear what you're saying.
Yeah, so that's also returning to the idea of keeping body and mind in this whole conversation.
Yes.
Whether it's our glycemic levels, or our lack of sleep, or our hormones, or whatever it is.
I think so. And I think, yeah. And I think it's a willingness, again, because I travel in sort of the spiritual circles, is a willingness to also just be an ordinary human being. Yeah. To just enter into that, whatever that means for each person, because I think that's an intimate thing.
It's relaxing.
It's relaxing to like join the human family.
As opposed to what?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind, it's a great question, by the way, so thank you. The first thing that comes to my mind is the first time when I had sort of this more revelatory experience of unity And it was kind of like, oh, wow, I can see myself in everything.
We are all one.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff. And it was wonderful and revelatory. It, of course, created a lot of change, you know. And then what I discovered was that, as beautiful and amazing as that is, that's a on top of the mountaintop experience, which are transformative. But I had to come into a different quality of experience to translate that into hearing with you.
Yep.
Because if I'm on the mountaintop, we don't got much to talk about.
You and the llama and the llamas up there are having a great time.
Right, it's just like, oh, it's all one, it's all fine.
Yes.
You know, whether we all live or die, it's all fine.
And by the way, I think retreats like that are really important for the nervous system and the body.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Ground
it's
zero.
like stock and trade. But I think the translation of that, this is where I was going with it, was what I saw the translation to that in order to bring it down here. It was, you know, revelatory experiences kind of lift you up. And what I saw was there was its corresponding revelation, but it was its inverse opposite,
yes.
which was a willingness to come down and join into the human family exactly as it is. And that wasn't necessarily an uplifting experience. It was that beautiful, intimate, humbling experience of unity. Also means just like you.
Yeah,
and
meeting.
Just like you, and just like that person over there that I may or may not, you know, agree with.
Right.
But it's just the just like you-ness is, it's different than uplifting and revelatory. It's sort of beautiful, humbling intimacy. So for me, that was the beginning, you know, of probably an endless unfolding of what that actually means to bring all this into relationship.
Yeah, and how it can be different in every interaction. Right?
Sure, it's different when you have a 4-year-old kid.
Or anybody,
Or
professional,
60-year-old.
colleagues, anybody.
It changes, yeah. And I mean, this is one of the things when we had that lunch together that I, you know, as I've told some people, you know, we started talking and then I had to go almost 3 hours later. The poor waiter never got an order in because all the three of us were like just talking, you know. In fact, I asked Alanis just tonight, I said, did you guys ever eat lunch after I had to leave?
We did have soup.
Yeah, I was thinking about the waiter, like all this time later, I'm like, oh, I hope the waiter got something.
He was so excited, by the way.
But I was really, it was really heartening. I was really impressed of the dedication that you showed to all these causes, but not just like a banner leader for a cause, but it seemed like you talked a lot about your intimate involvement in some of these things that were really important to you, like really getting there and putting yourself out there and speaking and talking to people in a different way than when you're performing or something.
Yes.
And I thought that was really, really quite lovely and amazing, because I think a lot of people feel called to engage, and yet they don't engage because they're always thinking so big. I think it keeps them from going
To the micro intimacy?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think even if we do engage big, in a bigger way, that it's the micro intimate, it's the micro stuff, it's getting actually in there.
Yeah, and to me they're
doing
commensurate. Like the micro and the macro are the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, they have to be.
It's the same dynamic.
Now,
It's that.
Alanis, what would be your pith relationship wisdom? I'm curious. I know how important intimate relationships are to you, and relationships in general. I'm curious if you were to just really bring it down to your sort of pith instructions, if you will, for wisdom
Thanks.
in relationships.
I would say that commitment and intimacy is commensurate to the degree of healing and a sense of oneness for me. And so that means that if my husband Solai says something, I consider what he says to me to be some kind of a blueprint for where I'm to go next. In whatever form he shares it with me, it could be in frustration, it could be in peaceful, quiet little whisper. It could be something he doesn't even directly communicate, but I know that if I am, I think it could be an important tangent for me anyway, is that for a long time I was attempting to love myself, quote unquote, when I hated myself. And I was having a hard time with it. I was having a hard time looking in the mirror saying, I love you, Alanis, you're a really sweet woman, and it just wasn't working for me. And so one shortcut for me was to love in another what I hate in them. And so marriage is awesome for that. Sorry, honey.
Love you, sweetheart.
I love you, sweetie. Because on a very real level, I do see that I am inextricably connected and interconnected with my husband and with my intimate friends. And if we have any trouble, I get excited now. Because I think, wow, this could potentially be great for both of us. So getting really great, not so much that there's some way to avoid stepping on each other's toes or bumping into each other. I think that's inevitable and unavoidable. It's more, how quickly can I repair it? How quickly can I move toward this interaction that might be hard or, in some ways demanding me to shut down? How can I stay open, and how can I cultivate that quality of curiosity of what's happening here? And that for me is where my academic geeky part comes into play, where I can have a quick moment of stepping back, almost stepping out of my body and going, oh, look at what we're up to here. All of it with the incentive of wanting to support, in this case, my husband, to be the full human that he was born to be on an essential level. And that this false presentation, all these great words that we use to describe the image that we support, that I'm not really that interested in having a marriage between images. I'm more interested in having a connection between the core of who we are. There's so many beautiful words that can be used for that, but and I've always wanted that, and I've actually been shamed for it a lot. I've been dumped numerous times for this desire to connect that was deemed, sometimes it was codependent and sometimes it was a little much, but ultimately it was, at its core, it was a desire to feel the connection that is God to me and feel it in different contexts that are appropriate. And I live for the functionality of relationships. So another big question for me in any interaction with my dear friends and my husband is, how could we make this a tiny bit more functional so that we could really embody the idea of us both being passionate friends in marriage's case, but also in general, that's a little bit of a piece.
And what I hear in there, Alanis, and tell me if this kind of resonates for you, is that something that I really found, I've been married for almost 20 years now, and is that, the way we define relationships is we don't often have accurate definitions of what, especially long-term relationships were. And I remember at some point it really dawned on me. I had it in my head before this, but really, which was, a life together is a life together. It's a journey. It's not about
some finish line.
It's not about some finish line, and it's not necessarily about although I think there's the underlying beauty of the connectedness or the romance or all those like frostings that are on the top. But underneath that, it's a life share.
Right.
At a really intimate, very, as you're talking, real level.
Yeah. Where
we really are interested in each other, that we're really willing to step out of ourselves and actually have a life that's actually together, instead of me and you, we're together, but we're basically
parallel life.
We're parallel.
Yeah.
We're parallel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, well, there's a lot more I want to talk to you two about, so I'm going to just keep getting right to it here. I think that one of the myths, if you will, in my opinion, about spiritual awakening is that once you have that ability to not always be seeing through an egoic framework, that you don't have any pain anymore. You don't grieve.
No suffering.
No suffering. No, when challenges come, you float, they float on, you and they float on by. You're on a cloud, in a lotus position while the challenges. And I'd be curious to hear from both of you, how you see working with suffering, grief, loss, difficulties in a different way. How do you both see that from the perspective of awakening in the world?
For me, thank you. For me, it's going all the way through to the bottom of it. And I experienced this directly with my 4-year-old son. When he feels frustration or disappointment or joy or sadness or grief, that I just sit with him. And he sees my eyeballs looking at him, and if he's up for it, I'll put my hand on his shoulder or the back, or just sit there with him. What I share with the people around me is I'll often say, give us 12 minutes, but it's usually 3 minutes. And then if I afford him the space to have the entire experience, that there's a bottom, and then the next current occurs. So for me, it's about showing up and being present for every part. Specifically for me, my growth journey has been to show up for the parts that are scary for me. In the past, I might have had a tendency to want to stop the suffering or stop the crying, or even in my own self, because that was the pervasive message that I was taught, which is specifically as a woman, don't feel sad and don't feel angry. And for me, I got angrier and sadder. So my main incentive with my son and the people I love who are in my kind of inner circle and beyond on a macro level is to invite what's happening now, to feel the wave of the emotion all the way through the full body. And then that's it. And so far, when my son is finished with his 15 minutes of feeling, he just kind of looks up and kind of gives me a little virtual wink and then moves on to the next thing. So I can't remember what your question was. But the idea of offering...
Oh, no, I got to remember what the question was.
But the offering of that allowance for the humanity, allowance for the wave, while knowing the truth of who we are, all at the same time.
Gee, how do I even approach that question? It's a big question, isn't it? It's a really big question. Well, my whole sort of search wasn't, at least not in a conscious way, probably at some level, but not in a conscious way. It wasn't generated by suffering. In fact, my search actually made me suffer. I was worse off after I started to engage than I was before. I thought, what the hell did I get myself involved with,
I changed my mind.
Yeah, I'm looking for eternal happiness and it's making me miserable.
You don't like airports?
So I started off relatively happy. Actually, relatively happy human being. When people ask my dad, like, what do you remember about Adya or whatever, and he always says, well, he came in smiling. And I did come in smiling, and even someone that comes in smiling has had plenty of suffering in their life. Nobody gets through this thing for more than a few days, unscathed in some way. And of course, a lot of people who know me, know that a few times over the last, at least a few public times, not all the unpublic times, but I've gone through extraordinary physical pain, extraordinary pain, and that will boils everything down to a very sort of primal level when you're sort of sitting there wondering, okay, how do I get through the next minute? Forget tomorrow. I can't contemplate tomorrow. But how about the next minute? And I think it always goes back to something, in one manner of speaking, that you were mentioning about. It is the willingness to have a full experience. I think that's how all of the suffering, we're not just talking, little things during the day, but the suffering that human beings tend to carry. They carry through their life year after year, decade after decade, and you're kind of suffering a lot of the same underlying themes are going upon. And those are because we've had experiences that we either didn't allow or couldn't allow to play themselves out. We weren't there yet. We weren't mature enough. We weren't conscious enough to embody that immense of experience. I'm sure you see it with your child, where sometimes children have experiences and you can just see them getting overwhelmed and it's too big, and then they have a meltdown because they're right at that moment they're experiencing something that's too much for them to embody, and so they just come apart for a while.
And it's our job as parents, in theory, to regulate or corral or help them, soothe them, really.
Let them know that even that's okay.
Yeah,
even that's okay. Yeah. Like somehow we understand.
The curb your enthusiasm thing.
Yeah. But so I never had a big relationship, even between awakening, the whole enlightenment search, all that. For me personally, it wasn't about suffering. It wasn't about my suffering. Mine was a love affair with what's true, what's real. If I had come from a life where I was in a lot of angst or sorrow, it would have been a lot about suffering. Every journey is about suffering to some extent. There's a subterranean things that were there. To me, of course, my lifetime of spiritual practice and all of that engendered certainly has allowed immense amount of suffering to fall away. And it's also, strangely, paradoxically, given me a much greater capacity for sorrow. A much greater capacity for sorrow. My dad just passed away, right? 3 weeks ago or something like that, and I was up there with him, and I was, for the 5 days before he died, when he was a little bit communicative, and then in the last 3 days, and I was stroking his head, and wiping him down, and just at his bedside, I was at his bedside. I was watching him slowly die. And fortunately, we had a lot of discussion, and we didn't have any unfinished business about everything that was going on. But there's an immensity of experience when there's a death, And I was hit at the absolute paradoxical nature of this. I remember at one point I was in there with him very near where the time he actually passed, and I thought, this reminds me, the energy here is exactly like when I was in the delivery room with my younger sister when she had her first child. And this feels like a death and a birth. And grief and something of such profound meaning and beauty was happening at the same time that I was just like, I'm still kind of, to me it's just this, almost like a state of awe. Like how these paradoxical things come together to form something of such significance. And it is the coming together of death, which is, of course, can have suffering in it. And of course, the people left behind. Death's always a bigger thing for the people who are left behind than for the people who passed. And I think it's part of, to kind of come back and just complete this theme, is it's a kind of willingness to embrace everything that it means to be walking around on this planet. I think that the paradox is the more we embrace it, the bigger we are and everything that it means to be big enough to embrace, to feel, to have the experience, that the less overwhelming it all is. That the less we actually suffer. It's strange. The more we're willing, the less we suffer.
It's a resilience for the human experience.
That's a great word. It's a resilience.
And what I watch you and I just think of the intrapersonal intelligence and the intelligence of spiritual intelligence, all these multiple intelligences that we embody. Essentially, we have these core intelligences, and that the connection with spirit or waking up is going to look, however many people there are on this planet, it will look different for every single person, utilizing the intelligences that we either are aware of and using as a thank you to God, or not using, but that we have within us. And then for those of us who have some intelligences and want to cultivate others, we would do that. But the intrapersonal intelligence yields the curiosity, the continuing to ask the question until you're home, even the impulse or the desire or movement toward wanting to even know God and truth and life and love and connection and intimacy. in some ways I think of that as an intelligence, and we're either cultivating it or we're not cultivating it.
And we often have different intelligence in different parts. We can have great emotional intelligence and very poor intelligence in some areas. We can have great relational intelligence, or we can not have very good relational intelligence.
Or academic, or neurobiological, or whatever our intelligences are.
Right.
And then the invitation is, if we want to cultivate others that we may be compelled to cultivate, or not.
And I think it's also about embodying a kind of, I think of it as, it's an old word I use. I just like old words, so pardon me. But a kind of, I think part of all this is really discovering our own autonomy, our own sovereignty. Like what I mean by that is where you hinted there at awakening's not going to look the same for every person. For one person, it might look like Ramana Maharshi, that's basically an ascetic and renounces the world, and then people gather and are inspired, and it changes their lives, and that's the way. For somebody else, it's going to be an extraordinary activist. For someone else, it's going to be a grandmother that nobody's ever heard of, but she's like just the most extraordinary light in the world. And I think one of the most important things in order to discover our own personal human and spiritual autonomy is its own journey, because we have to stop, we have to let go of the ideas of what we think our life's supposed to look like.
And that violence of comparison on that journey, as though there's something to aspire to that is not here already.
Yeah, so painful.
So, ouchie.
You do have a child.
Can't help myself.
I love that.
Okay, I just have one final question for you both. This morning, Adya, you gave a talk about living in accord with the deepest thing we know, giving our lives fully to the deepest thing we know. And so I'd like to ask you both, as we bring our conversation to a close, what's the deepest thing you know?
And you're looking at me when you ask that question. Okay, I can only give you a very unsatisfactory answer, but I mean it's a very sincere answer. It's the most honest answer I can give. And I've reflected upon this in the last year quite a bit, is that anything that I could say, the deepest thing that I know, the deepest thing that I realized, it always ends up, when I'm really honest about it, it's especially given what I do for a living, it's almost ironic to the point of hilarity. It's the one thing that I can't say. It's the one thing I can't even say to myself. My mind can't get its arms around it and go, this is the important thing, Adya, this is what it is. There's no lack of clarity about what it is. I feel it in every cell of my body. I can talk around it. I love freedom, and I'm interested in being a benevolent presence in the world, and I'm interested in what it means to not only to wake up, but actually what it means to live and embody and express that. Those are all parts of what are really interesting. They're very important to me. My life with my wife Mukti is as high as any of those and higher than most. That's an extraordinary important thing for me. But that's just dancing around the fire. I can't describe and name the fire, which I don't know how to do it.
Yeah, the concretization of it almost reduces it. On an egoic level, I would say, to serve, to connect, to support my own expression and everyone's expression, the movement of energy, being responsible for the speed with which the current rushes through you. I could probably write 100 pages on that, the answer to that beautiful question. And I also, my brain kind of short circuits when I heard it, because I just thought, I don't know, I'll find out. I'll find out in every moment.
I feel fully satisfied.
All
right. We're going to take a 30-minute break and then come back and have the great joy of an acoustic concert with Alanis Morissette.